Detective Marcus Thompson had been walking the same beat for 12 years, and in his mind, he had seen it all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Millfield Avenue as he patrolled the busy shopping district, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming. But beneath that polished exterior lay a man whose prejudices had grown deeper with each passing year, fed by his own narrow worldview and the echo chamber of like-minded colleagues. That Thursday started like any other. Thompson was making his rounds when he spotted her, a young white woman, maybe 19 or 20, walking quickly down the sidewalk with her head down. Sarah Martinez was hurrying to catch the bus after her shift at the local coffee shop, her mind occupied with thoughts of her evening classes and the essay she still needed to finish. She wore a simple sundress and sneakers, her backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware that she had caught the attention of someone who would soon turn her ordinary day into a nightmare. Thompson watched Sarah from across the street, his eyes narrowing as he observed her movements. In his warped perception, something about her hurried pace and nervous glances seemed suspicious. Perhaps it was the way she clutched her purse tightly, or how she kept checking her phone. To most people, these would seem like the normal behaviors of a young woman trying to catch public transportation, but Thompson's biases colored his interpretation of everything he saw. "Excuse me, miss," Thompson called out as he crossed the street, his voice carrying the authority that came with his position. Sarah stopped and turned, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the police officer approaching her. She had always been taught to respect law enforcement, to cooperate and be polite. Her parents had raised her to believe that police officers were there to help and protect people like her. "Yes, officer," Sarah replied, her voice soft and respectful. She adjusted her backpack and waited, assuming this was perhaps a routine check or maybe the officer needed directions to somewhere. Thompson looked her up and down with an expression that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. "I need to ask you a few questions. There have been reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I need to make sure you're not involved in anything you shouldn't be." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "Suspicious activity? I'm just trying to catch the bus home from work." "I haven't done anything wrong." She glanced around, noticing that several other people were walking by without being stopped or questioned. The realization that she had been singled out began to dawn on her, though she couldn't yet understand why. "That's what they all say," Thompson replied with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm going to need to search you to make sure you're not carrying anything illegal. It's standard procedure." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Something about this didn't feel right, but she had always been taught to comply with police requests. I don't understand. What kind of suspicious activity? I was just walking to the bus stop." "Don't make this difficult, miss. The sooner you cooperate, the sooner this will be over." Thompson's tone had grown more commanding, more intimidating. He gestured toward a narrow alley between two buildings. "We'll need to step over here for privacy." Every instinct in Sarah's body was screaming that something was wrong, but the authority of the uniform and badge overwhelmed her better judgment. She followed Thompson into the alley, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to understand what was happening to her. What happened next would be seared into Sarah's memory forever. Thompson, emboldened by the privacy of the alley and his perceived authority, conducted what he claimed was a routine search in a manner that was anything but routine or appropriate. His actions were unprofessional, invasive, and completely inappropriate, crossing lines that should never be crossed by someone in a position of trust and authority. Sarah stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as Thompson violated both her dignity and her rights under the guise of police procedure. She felt powerless, trapped between her ingrained respect for authority and her growing understanding that something terrible was happening to her. Her voice caught in her throat as she tried to object, but Thompson's position of power made her feel helpless to resist. "Please," she whispered, "this doesn't feel right. I don't think you're supposed to—" I decide what's supposed to happen here, Thompson cut her off harshly. You'll do as I say if you know what's good for you. Unknown to either of them, someone had been watching from the beginning of this encounter. Judge Amara Williams was returning from lunch when she noticed the interaction between the officer and the young woman. Something about the officer's body language and the woman's obvious distress had caught her attention. Judge Williams had spent 15 years working her way up through the legal system, first as a prosecutor and then as a defense attorney before being appointed to the bench. She had seen enough cases of police misconduct to recognize the warning signs. Judge Williams positioned herself where she could observe without being seen, and what she witnessed made her blood run cold. As a black woman who had fought against systemic injustice her entire career, she recognized the abuse of power playing out before her eyes. She quickly pulled out her phone and began recording, knowing that without evidence, this young woman's word against a police officer's would likely be dismissed or ignored. The recording captured everything: Thompson's inappropriate behavior, Sarah's clear distress and objections, and the officer's abuse of his authority. Judge Williams felt a familiar fire burning in her chest, the same righteous anger that had driven her to pursue justice throughout her career. This time, however, she wasn't just observing injustice from the bench. She was witnessing it firsthand and had the power to do something about it immediately. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Thompson stepped back, straightening his uniform as if nothing had happened. "You're free to go," he told Sarah dismissively. "And remember, this was just a routine check. Nothing to get worked up about." Sarah stumbled out of the alley, her dress wrinkled and her dignity shattered. She felt confused, violated, and unsure of what had just happened to her. The authority of Thompson's position had left her questioning her own perceptions, wondering if maybe this really was normal police procedure and she was overreacting. Judge Williams watched Sarah emerge from the alley and saw the telltale signs of someone who had just been victimized. The shaky hands, the 1,000-yard stare, the way she kept adjusting her clothing. Williams had seen these same signs in countless courtrooms, but seeing them in person, knowing she could have prevented this if she had acted sooner, filled her with determination. As Thompson began to walk away, clearly pleased with himself and confident that nothing would come of his actions, Judge Williams stepped out from her concealed position. She approached Sarah first, her voice gentle but firm. "Excuse me, dear," Judge Williams said softly, not wanting to startle the already traumatized young woman. "My name is Amara Williams, and I'm a judge here in the county. I saw what just happened to you, and I want you to know that what that officer did was not legal, not appropriate, and not something you have to accept." Sarah looked up at Judge Williams with a mixture of confusion and hope. For the first time since the encounter began, someone was validating her feelings that something had been terribly wrong. I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said it was routine. He said he had the right to search me because of suspicious activity." Judge Williams felt her jaw clench as she heard how Thompson had manipulated this young woman's trust in authority. "What he did to you was sexual assault under the color of law. No police officer has the right to conduct the kind of search I witnessed. There are strict protocols for searches, especially of women, and what he did violated every one of them." Sarah's legs felt weak as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "Are you sure? I mean, he's a police officer. I thought I had to do what he said." "You never have to submit to illegal treatment, even from a police officer," Judge Williams explained gently. "And I have video evidence of everything that happened. You're not alone in this, and we're going to make sure he faces consequences for his actions." Meanwhile, Thompson was walking back toward the main street, completely unaware that his actions had been witnessed and recorded. In his mind, he had successfully intimidated another person and gotten away with it, just as he had done many times before. His sense of untouchability fed by years of getting away with smaller abuses of power, had grown into the dangerous arrogance that led to this assault. Thompson's pattern of behavior hadn't started with this incident. Over the years, he had gradually pushed boundaries, testing how much he could get away with. Small acts of intimidation had escalated to inappropriate comments, which had then grown into inappropriate touching during searches. Each time he faced no consequences, his behavior became more brazen. Sarah was simply his latest victim in a long line of people he had victimized under the cover of his badge. Judge Williams helped Sarah collect herself and offered to drive her to the police station to file a report. "I know this is terrifying," she said, "and I know it's tempting to just try to forget this happened and move on. But if we don't hold him accountable, he'll do this to someone else. You have the power to stop him, and I have the evidence to make sure justice is served." Sarah looked at Judge Williams, seeing strength and determination in the older woman's eyes. For the first time since the assault, she felt like she had an ally, someone who understood the gravity of what had happened and had the knowledge and power to help her seek justice. "What do I need to do?" Sarah asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "First, we're going to file a police report with Internal Affairs. Then we're going to make sure the district attorney's office sees the video evidence. This officer is going to learn that his badge doesn't give him the right to assault innocent people," Judge Williams replied with steely determination. As they walked toward Judge Williams's car, neither woman knew that this was just the beginning of a fight that would expose a pattern of abuse and ultimately lead to significant changes in how police misconduct was handled in their community. Thompson's actions had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy his career and vindicate not only Sarah, but other victims who had been too frightened to speak out. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Judge Williams started her car, but for Sarah this wasn't the end of a terrible day. It was the beginning of her journey toward justice. With Judge Williams as her advocate, she was about to discover that the system, while flawed, still had people within it who were willing to fight for what was right. Thompson, still unaware of the storm that was about to engulf him, continued his patrol, his confidence intact and his sense of invincibility stronger than ever. He had no idea that his career was about to come to an abrupt and very public end, or that the woman who had been silently observing his crime was someone with the knowledge, authority, and determination to ensure that justice would be served. The stage was set for a confrontation between abuse of power and the pursuit of justice, between those who use their authority to harm others and those who use their position to protect the vulnerable. Sarah Martinez, an innocent young woman who had simply been trying to catch a bus home from work, was about to become the catalyst for change that would resonate far beyond her own case. Judge Williams gripped the steering wheel tighter as she thought about the video on her phone and the young woman sitting beside her. In her years on the bench, she had seen too many cases where victims of police misconduct were dismissed, ignored, or intimidated into silence. But not this time. This time, there was evidence. There was a witness with credibility and authority, and there was a victim brave enough to seek justice. The real battle was just beginning. The fluorescent lights in the Internal Affairs office cast a harsh glare over the sterile room as Sarah Martinez sat across from Detective Captain Rebecca Chen. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, still trembling slightly from the events of the previous day. Judge Williams sat beside her, a reassuring presence in what felt like an overwhelming situation. Captain Chen had been with Internal Affairs for 8 years, and she had seen her share of misconduct cases. But there was something about this case that struck her deeply. Perhaps it was the clear video evidence that Judge Williams had provided, or maybe it was the way Sarah's voice shook as she recounted her experience. Whatever it was, Chen was determined to handle this case with the thoroughness and sensitivity it deserved. "Sarah, I want you to know that we take allegations like this very seriously," Captain Chen began, her voice professional but kind. I've reviewed the video evidence that Judge Williams provided, and I want to assure you that Officer Thompson's behavior was completely inappropriate and illegal. Sarah nodded, grateful to hear someone in law enforcement acknowledging what she had experienced. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind of emotions: shame, anger, confusion, and fear. Judge Williams had been by her side throughout the process, explaining her rights and helping her understand what would happen next. "What I need from you now is a detailed statement of everything that happened," Chen continued. "I know this is difficult, but the more information you can provide, the stronger our case will be." As Sarah began to recount her story, Captain Chen took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The video evidence was damning, but Chen knew that Thompson's defense attorney would likely try to poke holes in the case wherever possible. Every detail mattered. "He told me it was standard procedure," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He made me feel like I was being unreasonable for questioning it. I trusted him because he was a police officer." Judge Williams placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "That's exactly how predators in positions of authority operate. They use that trust and authority to manipulate their victims." Captain Chen nodded grimly. "Unfortunately, you're absolutely right, Judge Williams. Officer Thompson used his position of power to commit a crime, and that makes his actions even more serious under the law." What none of them knew was that across town, Detective Thompson was going about his day completely unaware of the investigation that had begun. He was at the police station, joking with colleagues and filing routine paperwork, his confidence unshaken. In his mind, the encounter with Sarah was just another forgotten interaction, nothing more significant than checking someone's ID or giving directions. Thompson's partner, Officer David Rodriguez, noticed his unusually good mood. "You seem pretty cheerful today, Marcus. Good day on patrol yesterday?" Thompson shrugged with a smirk. "Same old stuff. Kept some troublemakers in line, made sure people knew who was in charge. You know how it is." Rodriguez had worked with Thompson for 3 years, and while he had occasionally felt uncomfortable with some of Thompson's attitudes, he had never witnessed anything that crossed the line into misconduct. Like many officers, he subscribed to the unofficial code of staying out of his partner's business unless absolutely necessary. Back in the Internal Affairs office, Captain Chen was explaining the next steps to Sarah and Judge Williams. "We'll be opening a formal investigation immediately. I'll need to interview Officer Thompson, and we'll be looking into his history to see if there have been any previous complaints or incidents." "What about criminal charges?" Judge Williams asked, her legal mind already thinking ahead to the various ways Thompson could be held accountable. "That will be up to the district attorney's office," Chen replied, "but given the video evidence and the nature of the crime, I expect they'll be very interested in pursuing charges." The mention of criminal charges sent a chill through Sarah. While she wanted justice, the thought of having to testify in court, of having her experience dissected and questioned by defense attorneys, felt overwhelming. Judge Williams seemed to sense her apprehension. "Sarah, I know this feels scary right now, but you have more support than you realize. The legal system isn't perfect, but it can work when there's clear evidence and people willing to fight for what's right." Over the next few days, Captain Chen began her investigation in earnest. She started by pulling Thompson's personnel file, looking for any patterns of behavior or previous complaints. What she found was troubling, though not entirely unexpected. There had been 3 previous complaints filed against Thompson over the past 5 years. One involved excessive force during an arrest, another concerned inappropriate comments made to a female motorist during a traffic stop, and the third alleged racial profiling. In each case, the complaints had been investigated but ultimately dismissed due to lack of evidence or credible witnesses. Chen also discovered that Thompson had received multiple commendations for his arrest record and his aggressive policing style. She realized that what the department had been praising as dedication to law enforcement was actually a pattern of escalating abusive behavior. The investigation expanded when Chen reached out to community organizations and local attorneys, asking if they had heard any other complaints about Thompson. What she found was deeply disturbing. Several people had stories of inappropriate behavior by Thompson, but they had never filed formal complaints, either because they didn't know how or because they feared retaliation. Maria Gonzalez, a local business owner, came forward to report that Thompson had harassed her teenage daughter during a routine stop 6 months earlier. "He made her feel so uncomfortable," Maria explained to Captain Chen during their interview. "She came home crying, but when we talked about filing a complaint, we were afraid it would just make things worse for our family." Similar stories began to emerge from the community. Thompson had been using his badge as a shield to commit increasingly serious acts of misconduct, targeting people he perceived as vulnerable or unlikely to fight back. His victims included young women, people of color, and individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people he believed the system was less likely to believe or protect. Meanwhile, District Attorney Patricia Hawkins was reviewing the case file that had been sent to her office. Hawkins had built her career on prosecuting difficult cases, and she had a particular passion for holding public officials accountable when they abused their power. "This is one of the clearest cases of assault under color of law I've ever seen," Hawkins told her assistant district attorney, James Morrison, as they watched Judge Williams' video for the third time. "The evidence is undeniable, and the victim's story is completely credible." Morrison nodded, but his expression was troubled. "The defense is going to argue that he was conducting a legitimate search. They'll try to make it about police procedure rather than assault. Then we'll make sure the jury understands exactly what legitimate police procedure looks like," Hawkins replied firmly. "We'll bring in expert witnesses, we'll show the department's own policies, and we'll make it crystal clear that what Thompson did was not law enforcement. It was a crime." The decision to press charges was announced on a Friday morning, sending shockwaves through the police department and the community. Detective Marcus Thompson was arrested at his home, the same hands that had violated Sarah's rights now placed in handcuffs as he was read his rights. Thompson's arrest was covered extensively by local media, and the story quickly gained national attention. The combination of clear video evidence, a credible witness, and a victim brave enough to speak out created a perfect storm for accountability. Judge Williams found herself thrust into the spotlight as the legal community and media praised her decision to intervene and document the assault. But she deflected the attention, consistently pointing back to Sarah's courage in coming forward and the importance of systemic change. "This isn't about me being a hero," Judge Williams told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. "This is about a young woman who was brave enough to seek justice and about a system that finally worked the way it's supposed to work. But we can't stop here. We need to examine how someone like Officer Thompson was able to abuse his power for so long without consequences." Thompson's arrest sent ripples through his circle of colleagues. Some officers expressed shock and disbelief, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the charges he faced. Others, like Officer Rodriguez, began to reflect on warning signs they might have missed or ignored. "I keep thinking back to things he said, ways he talked about people," Rodriguez confided to Captain Chen during his interview as part of the investigation. "I thought it was just tough talk, you know? Police work changes people. But now I'm wondering if I should have said something sooner." Chen nodded understandingly. "The culture of silence in law enforcement is something we need to address. Officers need to feel empowered to speak up when they see misconduct, not pressured to look the other way." As news of Thompson's arrest spread through the community, more victims began to come forward. The courage that Sarah had shown in speaking out had given others the strength to share their own experiences. Captain Chen found herself overwhelmed with new complaints and testimonies, each one painting a clearer picture of Thompson's pattern of abuse. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma, was called in to help support the growing number of victims. What Officer Thompson did represents a particularly insidious form of abuse, she explained during a community meeting. He used the trust and authority that society places in police officers to harm innocent people. The psychological impact of that betrayal can be devastating. Sarah found strength in learning that she wasn't alone, that her experience was part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated incident. Other survivors reached out to her, sharing their stories and offering mutual support. A network of healing and advocacy began to form around their shared experience. Judge Williams worked behind the scenes to ensure that the legal process moved forward efficiently and fairly. She reviewed evidence, consulted with prosecutors, and used her influence within the legal community to make sure Thompson's case received the serious attention it deserved. The police department, meanwhile, was facing intense scrutiny from both the public and oversight bodies. Chief Michael O'Brien found himself under pressure to explain how Thompson's behavior had gone unchecked for so long and what steps the department would take to prevent similar incidents in the future. "We are conducting a comprehensive review of our policies and procedures," Chief O'Brien announced at a press conference. "We are also implementing new training programs focused on recognizing and preventing misconduct, and we are establishing clearer channels for reporting and investigating complaints." But many community members, led by Judge Williams and other advocates, argued that policy changes weren't enough. They demanded structural reforms, including independent oversight of police misconduct investigations and mandatory training on bias and abuse of power. As Thompson sat in his cell awaiting trial, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The shield of authority that had protected him for so long was gone, replaced by the cold reality of the criminal justice system. For the first time in years, he was powerless, dependent on others for his fate. Sarah, meanwhile, was discovering her own strength. With the support of Judge Williams, the growing community of survivors, and her own determination to seek justice, she was transforming from a victim into an advocate. She began speaking at community meetings, sharing her story, and encouraging others to report misconduct when they encountered it. "I want people to know that you don't have to accept abuse, even from people in authority," Sarah told a packed auditorium at the local community center. "There are people willing to fight for justice, and there are systems in place to hold wrongdoers accountable, but only if we're brave enough to use them." The case was attracting attention from civil rights organizations, legal scholars, and policymakers at the state and national level. Thompson's arrest had become a symbol of the possibility for justice in cases of police misconduct, proof that with clear evidence and determined advocates, even officers who abused their power could be held accountable. But the real test would come at trial, where Thompson's defense team would likely pull out every tactic in the book to discredit Sarah, question Judge Williams's motivations, and argue that their client was simply doing his job. The battle for justice was far from over, and the most challenging phase was yet to come. The courthouse buzzed with energy as people filed in for the trial of Detective Marcus Thompson. 6 months had passed since his arrest, and the case had grown far beyond a simple assault charge. Thompson now faced multiple counts of sexual assault under color of law, deprivation of rights under color of law, and abuse of authority. Additional victims had come forward, and what started as one woman's brave stand for justice had become a reckoning with systemic abuse of power. Sarah Martinez sat in the front row of the courtroom, her transformation over the past months remarkable to anyone who had known her before. The timid young woman who had been victimized in that alley had grown into a confident advocate for justice. Judge Williams sat beside her, as she had throughout this entire journey, a steady presence and mentor who had become like family. District Attorney Patricia Hawkins had assembled a formidable prosecution team for this case. The evidence was overwhelming, but she knew that defense attorney Robert Chen, no relation to Captain Chen from Internal Affairs, would fight viciously to protect his client. Chen was known for his aggressive tactics in defending police officers, and he had already begun planting seeds of doubt in the media about the motivations of the accusers and the validity of the evidence. As Judge Harold Martinez, also no relation to Sarah, called the court to order, the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. This wasn't just about one man's crimes, it was about whether the justice system could hold its own accountable, whether victims of police misconduct could find real justice, and whether the culture of silence and protection that enabled such abuse could finally be broken. Hawkins rose to deliver her opening statement, her voice clear and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the abuse of power in its most fundamental form. Detective Marcus Thompson took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this community. Instead, he used his badge, his uniform, and the authority you and I granted him to prey upon innocent people. She walked closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. Over the next few days, you will see video evidence that clearly shows Thompson sexually assaulting Sarah Martinez under the pretense of conducting a police search. You will hear from other victims who suffered similar abuse at his hands, and you will learn about a pattern of escalating misconduct that the police department failed to address for years. Defense attorney Chen's opening statement took a predictably different approach. He painted Thompson as a dedicated officer who had served the community for 12 years, making difficult decisions in dangerous situations. He suggested that the encounters in question were legitimate police procedures that had been misinterpreted and blown out of proportion by activists with an agenda against law enforcement. My client is not a predator, Chen argued. He is a police officer who is doing his job in challenging circumstances. The video you will see has been taken out of context, and the accusations against him are part of a coordinated attack on law enforcement by people who want to undermine the authority of police officers. The first witness called by the prosecution was Judge Williams herself. She took the stand with dignity and authority, her years of legal experience evident in her composed demeanor. Hawkins walked her through the events of that afternoon, establishing her credibility as a witness and the circumstances that led her to record the assault. I noticed Officer Thompson approaching Ms. Martinez because his body language seemed aggressive and predatory, Judge Williams testified. As someone who has spent 15 years in the legal system, I've learned to recognize the signs of someone abusing their authority. When defense attorney Chen cross-examined Judge Williams, he attempted to suggest that her intervention was motivated by anti-police bias rather than genuine concern for Sarah's welfare. Isn't it true, Judge Williams, that you have a history of ruling against police officers in civil rights cases? Judge Williams fixed him with a steady gaze. Mr. Chen, I have ruled in favor of the law and the evidence presented in my courtroom, regardless of whether the parties involved were police officers or private citizens. My oath as a judge requires me to be impartial, and that's exactly what I've always been. The moment everyone had been waiting for came when the prosecution played the video evidence. The courtroom fell silent as the clear footage showed Thompson's assault on Sarah. Several jurors visibly reacted with shock and disgust as they watched the officer abuse his authority in such a blatant manner. Sarah's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She spoke clearly and powerfully about her experience, describing not just the physical assault, but the psychological impact of being betrayed by someone she had been taught to trust and respect. I kept thinking I must be wrong, that this must be normal police procedure because I couldn't believe that a police officer would do something like that to me, Sarah testified. He used my trust in his authority against me, and that betrayal was almost as traumatic as the assault itself. During cross-examination, Chen attempted to portray Sarah as confused and mistaken about what had happened to her. Isn't it possible, Ms. Martinez, that you simply misunderstood standard police search procedures? Sarah's response was firm and clear. Mr. Chen, I know the difference between a professional search and sexual assault. What Officer Thompson did to me was assault, and no amount of legal maneuvering will change that fact. The prosecution then called several other victims who had come forward after Thompson's arrest. Maria Gonzalez testified about her daughter's harassment, while college student Jennifer Park described a similar encounter she had experienced the year before. Each testimony built a clear pattern of predatory behavior that had escalated over time. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the trauma psychologist, testified about the psychological impact of Thompson's crimes. Sexual assault is devastating under any circumstances, but when it's committed by someone in a position of authority, the trauma is compounded by the victim's sense that the very system meant to protect them has betrayed them. Captain Rebecca Chen from Internal Affairs testified about the investigation and the disturbing pattern of behavior they had uncovered. Officer Thompson had received multiple complaints over the years, but he was consistently protected by a culture that prioritized loyalty to fellow officers over accountability to the community. The prosecution also called police procedure experts who testified that Thompson's actions bore no resemblance to legitimate search protocols. Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, a training instructor with 20 years of experience, explained the strict guidelines that govern police searches, especially of women. There is absolutely no scenario in which Officer Thompson's conduct would be considered appropriate or legal, Sergeant Rodriguez testified. He violated every protocol we have for conducting searches, and his behavior constituted clear criminal assault. When the defense presented their case, they relied heavily on character witnesses who testified to Thompson's good reputation and years of service. They also brought in their own police procedure expert who attempted to argue that Thompson's actions, while perhaps overzealous, fell within the broad discretion granted to police officers. Thompson himself took the stand in his own defense, a decision that many legal observers considered risky. Under questioning from his attorney, he maintained that he was conducting legitimate police business and that the video had been taken out of context. I was responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area, and I followed standard procedures for investigating potential criminal behavior, Thompson testified. Everything I did was within the scope of my authority as a police officer. But under cross-examination by District Attorney Hawkins, Thompson's story began to fall apart. When pressed for specifics about the suspicious activity he claimed to be investigating, he couldn't provide concrete details. When asked about the specific policies that authorized his conduct, he couldn't cite any. Officer Thompson, can you point to any police department policy or training that would justify the way you touched Ms. Martinez? Hawkins asked. Thompson's answer was rambling and evasive, clearly revealing that he knew his actions had been inappropriate. Well, you have to understand the dynamics of police work. Sometimes you have to make quick decisions based on your experience and training. That's not what I asked you, Hawkins pressed. I asked you to identify any policy or training that would justify your specific actions. Can you do that? I was following my training and experience, Thompson repeated, unable to provide a specific justification for his behavior. The closing arguments brought the case full circle. Hawkins delivered a powerful summation that emphasized the clear evidence of Thompson's crimes and the importance of holding him accountable. This case is about more than one man's crimes, she told the jury. It's about whether we as a society will tolerate the abuse of power by those we trust to protect us. The evidence is overwhelming. The video is clear. The victims are credible. Detective Thompson is guilty of these charges, and justice demands that you hold him accountable. Defense Attorney Chen made one final attempt to create reasonable doubt, arguing that police officers face difficult decisions and shouldn't be second-guessed by people who don't understand the challenges of law enforcement. Police officers put their lives on the line every day to protect our communities, he argued. My client was doing his job, and while his methods may have been imperfect, that doesn't make him a criminal. The jury deliberated for just over 4 hours before returning with their verdict. The courtroom was packed as the foreman stood to read the decision. On the charge of sexual assault under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority, we find the defendant guilty. The guilty verdicts on all counts sent a wave of emotion through the courtroom. Sarah broke down in tears, overwhelmed by relief and validation after months of reliving her trauma. Judge Williams embraced her, both women understanding the significance of what they had accomplished together. Thompson showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his shoulders slumped slightly as the reality of his situation set in. The man who had once seemed untouchable behind his badge was now facing years in prison. Judge Martinez sentenced Thompson to 8 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the sentencing guidelines. "Detective Thompson, you took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this community," the judge said during sentencing. "Instead, you preyed upon the very people you swore to protect. Your actions were not only criminal, they were a betrayal of the public trust that forms the foundation of law enforcement." But the impact of Thompson's conviction extended far beyond his individual case. The trial had exposed systemic problems within the police department and sparked a community-wide conversation about police accountability and reform. Chief O'Brien was forced to resign in the wake of the scandal, replaced by Deputy Chief Maria Santos, who had built her career on community policing and reform initiatives. One of Santos's first acts as chief was to implement comprehensive changes to how the department handled misconduct allegations. The police department established an independent oversight board with civilian participation, mandatory body cameras for all officers conducting searches, and annual training on appropriate use of authority. They also created a victim support program to help people who had been harmed by police misconduct. Judge Williams used the attention from the case to advocate for broader criminal justice reforms. She spoke at conferences and law schools across the country, sharing the lessons learned from Thompson's case and pushing for systemic changes to prevent similar abuses. This case succeeded because we had clear evidence, credible witnesses, and a victim brave enough to come forward, she told a gathering of judges and prosecutors. But we can't rely on chance to protect people from police misconduct. We need systems in place that prevent abuse and ensure accountability. Sarah became a powerful advocate for victims' rights and police reform. She established a support network for people who had experienced police misconduct and worked with lawmakers to strengthen protections for victims and witnesses. Her transformation from victim to advocate inspired countless others who had suffered similar abuse to come forward and seek justice. The case also led to legislative changes at the state level. New laws were passed requiring independent investigation of police misconduct allegations, establishing victim compensation funds, and creating stronger penalties for officers who abuse their authority. Thompson's conviction sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. Police departments began reviewing their own policies and procedures, and officers became more aware that their actions were subject to scrutiny and accountability. Officer Rodriguez, Thompson's former partner, became an advocate for police reform within the department. "We can't protect bad cops anymore," he told his fellow officers during training sessions. "When we stay silent about misconduct, we become part of the problem." The ripple effects of the case continued for years. Sarah earned her college degree and went on to law school, inspired by Judge Williams's example and determined to continue fighting for justice. Judge Williams was appointed to the state Supreme Court, where she continued her work on criminal justice reform. Thompson served his full sentence, and upon his release, he found himself unemployable in law enforcement and struggling to rebuild his life. His fall from authority to convicted felon served as a warning to other officers who might be tempted to abuse their power. The alley where Sarah was assaulted was eventually renamed Justice Way by the City Council, a permanent reminder of what happened there and the importance of standing up against abuse of power. A small plaque was installed that read, "In honor of all who find the courage to speak truth to power." Years later, Sarah would often walk past that alley on her way to work at the civil rights law firm she had founded. Each time, she thought about that terrifying afternoon when her world was turned upside down, and how Judge Williams' intervention had changed not just her life, but the lives of countless others who had suffered in silence. The case of Detective Marcus Thompson became a landmark example of how the justice system could work when ordinary people found the courage to stand up against abuse, when professionals in positions of authority chose to do what was right rather than what was easy, and when communities demanded accountability from those sworn to protect them. Judge Williams, now in her 70s and retired from the bench, often spoke about the case to young lawyers and judges. "Justice isn't something that just happens," she would tell them. "It requires people to act, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when it would be easier to look the other way." Sarah Martinez didn't set out to become a civil rights hero, but when faced with injustice, she chose to fight. That's how real change happens, one brave decision at a time. The story of Sarah Martinez and Judge Williams became more than just a case study in the legal system. It became a testament to the power of moral courage, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the possibility of justice even in the face of systemic corruption and abuse. Their partnership, a young woman finding her voice and an experienced judge using her authority to protect the vulnerable, showed that true justice requires both individual courage and institutional support. In the end, Thompson's abuse of power had inadvertently triggered the very changes that would prevent others like him from victimizing innocent people. His crimes, meant to demonstrate his authority over others, instead demonstrated the ultimate authority of justice over those who would abuse their power. The prejudiced policeman who thought his badge made him untouchable learned that no one is above the law, and that true justice, when finally served, is both swift and comprehensive.